Rachel Porter thought she was meeting her ex-boyfriend Mark Evans for one final goodbye. But instead, she stepped into a carefully planned trap that turned her last moment of kindness into the beginning of a chilling murder case. On a warm September evening, Rachel Porter walked across the college campus parking lot with a sense of relief. She was 19, balancing classes, friends, and the messy aftermath of a breakup. For weeks, she had tried to ignore the constant messages from her ex-boyfriend, Mark Evans. He had been persistent, refusing to accept the end of their relationship. But earlier that afternoon, he sent her something different. He wanted to meet one last time, he said, to talk things over and say goodbye properly. For Rachel, it sounded like closure, a chance to end things without guilt or lingering drama. She told herself it was the right choice, even though a quiet unease followed her all day. The campus lot was nearly empty by the time she arrived. A single street lamp cast a pale glow over the cracked pavement, stretching shadows across rows of silent cars. Mark's vehicle sat waiting at the far end, the engine already running, the headlights dimmed. Rachel paused for a moment, debating whether to go through with it, but brushed off her hesitation. She thought it would be nothing more than a short talk before returning to her dorm to finish homework. She stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind her. Witnesses later recalled seeing the car parked there for almost an hour. To anyone passing by, it looked like two young people trying to patch up a relationship or share a difficult goodbye. No one thought it might be the last time Rachel would be seen alive. Inside the car, the atmosphere was tense. Masked his agitation with forced calmness, but his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Rachel, tired of his back-and-forth moods, kept her voice steady, insisting she needed space and independence. She believed she was ending things on her terms, not realizing that Mark had no intention of letting her walk away. Rachel's friends would later say she had been nervous about meeting him. Some even urged her not to go, reminding her of the strange way he had been acting since the breakup. He had been following her more than once, showing up in places where she hadn't told him she would be. But Rachel dismissed these concerns, convincing herself that Mark simply needed a sense of closure. She wanted to be kind, not cruel. Thought meeting him would help both of them move on peacefully. Time dragged inside the car. Mark's words grew heavier, his tone less about farewell and more about anger. Rachel shifted uneasily, glancing at the dark parking lot outside. But she remained polite, still hoping the conversation would end soon. At one point, she reached for the door handle, intending to leave, but Mark stopped her, insisting she'd listen. To Rachel, it was just the final sting of a breakup. To Mark, it was a dangerous test of control. What happened after remains partly unclear. Investigators would later piece together fragments of evidence, reconstructing the night as best they could. But what is certain is that Rachel never left that car alive. By the time Mark drove away from campus, a young woman who thought she was attending a brief meeting for closure had unknowingly stepped into her own end. Her disappearance would set off alarms in the hours that followed. But in that moment, in the quiet darkness of the lot, there were no screams, no witnesses, no alarms. Just the hum of an engine and a chilling silence that swallowed Rachel Porter's last chance at freedom. Mark Evans had always been seen as the quiet type. To classmates, he was reserved, sometimes awkward, but never alarming. Yet beneath that outward calm, something dangerous had been forming. When Rachel ended their relationship, it was not just the loss of a girlfriend to him, it was the collapse of the only control he felt he had over his life. Friends noticed subtle changes at first. He grew withdrawn, less talkative, more intense, skipped classes without explanation, and spent long nights locked away in his small apartment. What no one realized was that his heartbreak had already turned into obsession. Rachel was determined to move forward. She spent time with friends, buried herself in her studies, and even began to enjoy the independence of single life. For her, the breakup was painful, but necessary, a chance to find herself again. For Mark, however, her independence was unbearable. He began to shadow her routine, following her to the campus library, waiting outside her classes, even standing at a distance during lunch just to watch. Rachel sometimes sensed eyes on her but brushed it off as imagination. She had no idea how carefully he was tracking her every move. Inside Mark's apartment, investigators would later find spiral notebooks filled with his handwriting. At first glance, they looked like journals of a struggling student, but the words revealed a much darker picture. Page after page contained angry ramblings about Rachel, his frustration at her refusal to return, and fantasies about regaining control. In the margins, he scribbled phrases that prosecutors would one day describe as warnings no one had seen in time. The spiral of obsession grew sharper when Mark turned to the internet. Late at night, he searched for chilling information: how to make someone disappear, how to bury evidence, how long phone records are stored. His search history became a roadmap of premeditation. It wasn't just heartbroken, he was planning. To those around him, the mask of normalcy remained. He still showed up occasionally for classes, nodding politely at acquaintances. When asked about Rachel, he brushed it off, saying they were taking time apart. Few suspected the storm building beneath his quiet exterior, yet subtle cracks were there. Friends remembered how his conversations always drifted back to Rachel, how he grew irritated at the mention of her moving on. He was less interested in reconciliation than he was in making sure she couldn't leave his grasp completely. Rachel, meanwhile, believed that distance would help both of them. She hadn't responded to most of his messages for weeks until that final text asking for one last meeting. To her, it sounded like a peaceful conclusion. To him, it was an opportunity he had been carefully waiting for. Every detail of that evening, from the timing to the place, had been chosen with purpose. When investigators pieced together Mark's mindset, they realized just how dangerous he had become long before Rachel stepped into his car. His quiet obsession wasn't sudden, it had been growing like a shadow, unnoticed by those around him. The final message he sent her was not about goodbye. It was bait, crafted by someone who had convinced himself that if he couldn't have her, no one else should. Rachel. I thought she was giving him kindness by agreeing to meet. In truth, she was stepping into the hands of a young man who no longer saw her as a person but as possessions slipping away. The night of her disappearance was not born out of impulse. It was the result of weeks of planning, anger, and a twisted sense of ownership that had reached its breaking point. By midnight, the silence in the Porter household was heavy. Rachel had not come home, and her phone went straight to voicemail with every attempt to call. At first, her parents thought she might have stayed late at the library or gone to a friend's dorm. But Rachel was responsible, and she always checked in. As the hours stretched into the early morning, worry turned into fear. Her car was still parked neatly outside her dorm, untouched, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. When she was reported missing, the response was immediate. Police began canvassing the area, retracing her last known steps. Friends spread the word on social media, turning her face into a haunting presence across hundreds of screens. Flyers appeared on street corners, grocery store windows, and bulletin boards around campus. The entire town seemed to stop and hold its breath, clinging to the hope that Rachel would turn up safe. Mark appeared to share in that hope. He showed up at search parties, his eyes tired but his voice steady, offering to help staple flyers onto wooden poles. He comforted Rachel's friends and even hugged her mother at one gathering, whispering reassurances that she would come back. To outsiders, it was the behavior of a caring ex-boyfriend who still wanted the best for her. But to a few who looked closer, there was something unsettling about his presence. Some volunteers noticed how he lingered near the detectives, casually asking what information they had, whether they had found her phone or if they had checked nearby towns. His questions seemed less like those of a concerned friend and more like those of someone monitoring the investigation. The details he fixated on weren't about Rachel's well-being. They were about the progress of the search. Detectives were trained to notice these subtleties. They began keeping quiet notes about Mark, though they didn't reveal their suspicions immediately. On the surface, his story was simple. He said they had met briefly, talked things through, and then he dropped her off before driving home. It was believable enough, but something about his demeanor gnawed at them. He didn't show the frantic energy most loved ones displayed. Instead, he seemed careful, measured, like a man rehearsing a role. Days turned into a week, and no sign of Rachel appeared. The search expanded beyond the campus, into rural fields, wooded areas, and abandoned roads. Volunteers trudged through thick brush, calling her name, hoping for a sign of life. The town's optimism dimmed with every fruitless search. Candlelight vigils replaced hopeful gatherings, and whispers of the worst outcome grew louder. Behind closed doors, investigators quietly began to unravel inconsistencies in Mark's story. His timeline of that night had gaps. He said he had been home by 10, but no one could confirm it. His phone records placed him in the area of her dorm. But there was also a suspicious gap in activity after he claimed to have returned home. Detectives were not ready to confront him directly. They knew they were circling closer to the truth. Meanwhile, Rachel's parents clung to hope, even as they braced for heartbreak. Her belongings sat untouched in her dorm room. Her textbooks lay open on the desk, her clothes neatly folded in the closet. It was as if she had stepped out for a short errand and never come back. Each time her mother walked past the room, she paused, staring at the silent space, waiting for her daughter's laugh to return. The town that once saw Rachel as a bright student now whispered about her as a missing girl whose fate seemed more uncertain by the day. And while the community searched, cried, and prayed, Mark maintained his carefully crafted image of a worried young man. But behind that mask, detectives suspected, was someone who already knew exactly where Rachel was and what had happened to her. Detectives had been patient. But by the second week of Rachel's disappearance, their patience was rewarded. Surveillance footage began to surface from businesses near the campus, and one grainy clip from a gas station became the first significant crack in Mark's alibi. I had told investigators that after talking with Rachel, he drove straight home. But the camera showed his car passing through at nearly midnight, far later than he had claimed, with a faint outline of a passenger beside him. The passenger never exited the car. Cell tower records added another layer. Mark's phone pinged. Along a rural stretch of road 30 miles outside of town that night, an area with no restaurants, no gas stations, and no friends or relatives to visit. When detectives asked why he would be there, he brushed it off, claiming he had taken a drive to clear his head. The explanation seemed thin, especially when paired with the growing inconsistencies in his statements. Investigators quietly secured a warrant to search his apartment. What they found was unsettling. In his browser history, Rachel's name appeared alongside troubling searches about shallow graves and decomposition. On a shelf, spiral notebooks were stacked neatly filled, with his scrawled handwriting pages that raged about betrayal, about not letting go, about making her understand. These discoveries turned suspicion into near certainty. Rachel's disappearance was no accident, and Mark was no helpless ex-boyfriend searching for closure. Still, investigators needed evidence that would lead them to Rachel. A small breakthrough came when they tracked the fresh tire marks found in the wooded area where Mark's phone had last pinged. The tracks matched the exact tread pattern of his vehicle. Cadaver dogs were brought to the scene, and within hours, the search team uncovered disturbed soil beneath a layer of leaves and branches. Beneath that shallow grave lay Rachel's body, carefully but hastily concealed. The discovery was devastating. For her family, the hope of finding Rachel alive was shattered in a single moment. For investigators, it was confirmation that their suspicions had been right all along. The crime scene spoke volumes. It wasn't a random act or a heat of a moment. Loss of control. It was deliberate. The grave had been prepared, the site chosen for isolation, the effort made to cover the evidence. Every detail pointed to planning. When detectives confronted Mark with the findings, his carefully controlled facade began to slip. He had played the part of the grieving ex for weeks, standing at vigils, handing out flyers, speaking to reporters. Now, seated in a small interrogation room, his story cracked. He tried to insist that Rachel had left his car safely, but the weight of the surveillance footage, the phone records, and the grave was too much to deny. His calm mask began to erode. Under the steady pressure of evidence, investigators saw what lay beneath. Not grief, but guilt. The town was rocked by the news. People who had searched shoulder to shoulder with Mark were stunned to learn he had been hiding the truth the entire time. The same hands that had passed out posters had been the ones to bury Rachel in the woods. The betrayal cut deep, leaving neighbors and friends shaken. Many replayed their interactions with him, realizing in hindsight that his calmness, his questions, his presence at every search event were not signs of care, but of a man keeping track of how close authorities were. To uncovering him, Rachel's parents were left with unimaginable pain. Their daughter had trusted someone she once loved, meeting him for what she thought would be closure, only to find betrayal in its most final form. For them, the discovery was both an ending and the beginning of a new nightmare, one where justice would have to stand in for the future Rachel never got to live. By the time detectives gathered the final pieces, there was no doubt. The story Mark told was a lie from start to finish. The truth had been written in Rachel's silence. The shallow grave and the digital trail he thought no one would find. The cracks in his alibi had not only exposed his guilt, they had revealed the full extent of his obsession and the fatal cost of Rachel's trust. The courtroom was silent the day Mark Evans walked in, his hands cuffed, his head bowed, and his face drained of color. The trial was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the final chance for justice in a story that had shattered an entire community. Rachel's parents sat in the front row, their faces pale but determined, while behind them friends, classmates, and townspeople filled every available seat. The once quiet college student was now remembered in photographs displayed outside the courthouse, smiling, brightened, alive. The contrast between those pictures and the grim details of the case hung heavy over every word spoken inside. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece. They began with the surveillance footage showing Mark's car. Rachel visible in the passenger seat, contradicting his claim that he had dropped her off safely. They presented the cell tower records that tracked his movements into the rural woods, where Rachel's body had been found. They showed the shovel discovered in his garage, with traces of soil that matched the burial site. Then came the notebook pages filled with angry words and disturbing phrases that pointed to a premeditated plan. Each piece of evidence was like a nail sealing his fate, leaving no room for doubt. The defense tried to paint a different picture. They spoke of heartbreak, of a young man overwhelmed by rejection, of emotions spiraling out of control in the heat of the moment. But the evidence told a story far too calculated for impulse. The internet searches, the timing of his trip to the woods, the shallow grave, all of it showed planning. This wasn't an accident born of grief. It was an act carried out with chilling deliberation. As the trial continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Rachel's parents listened in silence, their hands clasped together, their grief etched into every line of their faces. They had sat through the search, the waiting, the discovery of her body, and now they were forced to relive it all through testimony and photographs. The most painful detail was not just that Rachel was gone, but that she had trusted Mark enough to step into his car, believing she was safe. The betrayal was almost as unbearable as the loss. When the jury returned with their verdict, the air felt electric. Every eye fixed on the foreman as he stood and announced the decision: guilty of first-degree murder. Rachel's mother wept quietly, her father closing his eyes, the tension of weeks finally breaking. Mark sat motionless, his face unreadable, as though the weight of what he had done had finally settled on him. The judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. For the community, the verdict was both a relief and a reminder. Justice had been served, but the outcome could never replace the life stolen. Rachel would never walk across campus again, never graduate, never fulfill the dreams she had spoken of with her friends. Her absence left a wound that no verdict could. Close in the weeks that followed, vigils were held in her memory. Candles lit the night sky as friends shared stories of her kindness, her laughter, her plans for the future. Her name became a rallying cry for awareness, a reminder of the dangers that can hide behind familiar faces. Parents warned their children more sternly, and students walked in pairs at night, Carrying the lesson of Rachel's trust and its tragic cost, Mark's conviction ended the case, but it did not end the story. The betrayal lingered in the hearts of those who had searched for Rachel alongside him, unaware that he had already silenced her. It haunted the friends who replayed the moment she told them she was going to meet him, wishing they had insisted. Harder for her not to go, and it weighed most heavily on her family, who now lived with the reality that their daughter's kindness had been used against her. Rachel Porter thought she was walking into a conversation that would bring peace. Instead, she stepped into the final act of an obsession she could not see. Her story became a chilling reminder that the people who promise closure can sometimes be the very ones who mean to destroy it. The trial may have closed the case, but the echoes of that night would never fade.